On the night of March 27th, 1945, 27 Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers approached the Japanese coast flying at an altitude of just 5,000 feet, barely above the range of light anti-aircraft fire. Their bomb bays were loaded not with incendiary clusters or high explosives, but with acoustic and magnetic mines, each one weighing 2,000 pounds and equipped with sensors that could detect the sound of propellers or the magnetic signature of a ship's hull passing overhead. The aircraft were part of the 313th Bombardment Wing, flying from Tinian in the Mariana Islands, and their mission was the opening salvo of Operation Starvation, a campaign that would transform the Pacific War more decisively than any previous bombing effort. Over the next 5 months, B-29s would drop 12,000 mines in the waters around Japan, creating invisible barriers that would paralyze Japanese shipping, strangle the home island's economy, and kill more tonnage than American submarines had sunk in nearly 4 years of unrestricted warfare. Yet this campaign, one of the most successful applications of air power in military history, remains virtually unknown outside specialist circles. The strategic situation that gave birth to Operation Starvation was the product of geography and desperation. Japan is an island nation that in 1945 imported virtually everything required to sustain its war economy and feed its population. Oil came from the Dutch East Indies, rice from Korea and Indochina, iron ore from Manchuria, coal from China. These resources traveled by ship through narrow straits and shallow harbors that connected the outer empire to the home islands. If those shipping lanes could be closed, Japan would starve. The question was how to close them. Conventional submarine warfare had achieved remarkable success, sinking millions of tons of Japanese shipping. But by early 1945, most of Japan's remaining merchant vessels were operating in coastal waters too shallow for safe submarine operations. Aircraft carrier raids could strike specific targets but could not maintain continuous pressure. What was needed was a weapon that could be deployed rapidly, that would remain effective indefinitely, and that the Japanese could not easily counter. The answer was aerial mining, a technique that the Navy had advocated for years, but that the Army Air Forces, which controlled the B-29 force, had resisted implementing. The institutional resistance to mining operations reflected the Army Air Force's doctrinal commitment to strategic bombing of industrial targets. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the WWII Bomber Command, believed that incendiary attacks on Japanese cities would destroy the nation's capacity to continue fighting. He was not wrong. The firebombing campaign that began with Tokyo in March 1945 would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians and devastate dozens of urban centers. But LeMay was also a pragmatist who understood that results mattered more than ideology. When Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of Pacific Fleet, presented him with the Navy's plan for aerial mining, LeMay reviewed the projections, considered the alternatives, and agreed to allocate aircraft and crews to the mission. The decision was reluctant. Mining operations diverted resources from the firebombing campaign, but it was also realistic. If mining could achieve even a fraction of what the Navy claimed, the contribution to victory would justify the investment. The mines themselves were marvels of wartime engineering, sophisticated weapons that combined mechanical precision with psychological warfare. Each mine contained sensors tuned to detect specific signatures, the low-frequency sound of propeller cavitation for acoustic mines, the distortion of Earth's magnetic field caused by a steel hull for magnetic mines. Some mines were designed to detonate on the first detection, while others incorporated counters that would ignore multiple passes before triggering, frustrating Japanese mine-sweeping efforts that assumed cleared channels were safe. The mines could be set to activate immediately or after delays ranging from hours to weeks, creating uncertainty about when newly mined areas became dangerous. They were pressure-fused to explode beneath a ship's keel rather than on contact with the hull, maximizing damage by breaking the vessel's back. And they were delivered by parachute from altitudes that made accurate placement possible while keeping aircraft above most anti-aircraft defenses. The first mining mission on March 27th targeted the Shimonoseki Strait, the narrow passage between Honshu and Kyushu that connected the inland sea to the Sea of Japan. This was one of the most critical choke points in Japan's internal shipping network. Virtually all traffic between the main island and the resource-rich territories in Korea and Manchuria passed through Shimonoseki. Closing it would cut Japan in half logistically, isolating the southern islands from coal and food supplies produced in the north. The B-29s approached at night, flying individually rather than in formation, navigating by radar to find their assigned drop zones. The mines fell into the dark water, their parachutes slowing descent to prevent damage on impact. They sank to the bottom, activated their sensors, and waited. The Japanese response to the initial mining was confusion followed by alarm. Merchant captains who had survived years of submarine attacks now found themselves facing an invisible enemy that could not be detected until it was too late. Ships transiting Shimonoseki began exploding without warning, their hulls torn open by detonations that occurred beneath them rather than against their sides. The pattern of damage made clear that mines were responsible, but the nature and location of the mines were unknown. Were they magnetic or acoustic? Did they lie on the bottom or float at intermediate depths? Were they activated immediately or after delay? Without answers to these questions, effective countermeasures were impossible. Minesweeping vessels began working the channels, dragging magnetic cables and acoustic noisemakers through areas where mines were suspected. Some mines were successfully detonated. Others, equipped with ship counters, allowed the sweepers to pass and detonated hours or days later when merchant vessels followed the supposedly cleared routes. The psychological impact of the mining campaign was immediate and profound. Merchant mariners, already facing submarine attacks, aircraft strafing, and fuel shortages, now confronted an enemy that could not be seen, could not be fought, and operated according to logic that could not be predicted. Every voyage became a game of chance. Channels that had been safe yesterday might be deadly today. Routes that appeared clear might have been seeded with mines set to activate after delays. The only certainty was that someone, somewhere, was sinking, and that the same fate could arrive without warning. Ships began traveling in irregular patterns, hugging coastlines, reducing speed to minimize acoustic and magnetic signatures. These measures sometimes worked. Often they did not. The tonnage being sunk grew week by week. The B-29 crews assigned to mining missions quickly developed specialized techniques that maximized effectiveness while minimizing risk. Navigation was critical. Mines dropped in the wrong location were wasted, and some drop zones were narrow channels where precision mattered greatly. Radar operators became expert at identifying coastal features in darkness, guiding pilots to release points that had to be accurate within hundreds of yards. Bombardiers calculated wind drift, and adjusted release timing to compensate for the mine's parachute descent. Altitude discipline was essential. Too high, and accuracy suffered. Too low, and anti-aircraft fire became deadly. The missions lacked the drama of daylight bombing raids or the apocalyptic spectacle of firebombing attacks, but they demanded technical precision that was arguably more difficult to achieve. The expansion of the campaign beyond Shimonoseki demonstrated the flexibility and reach of aerial mining. B-29s began targeting secondary harbors, bays where coastal shipping gathered, river mouths where barges transported cargo inland. The inland sea, previously a safe haven where ships could shelter from submarine attack, became a killing zone. Tokyo Bay, Osaka Bay, Nagoya. Every major port received repeated mining strikes that closed or constricted shipping lanes. The Japanese transportation system, already strained by fuel shortages and labor conscription, buckled under the cumulative pressure. Factories ran out of raw materials. Urban populations faced food shortages. The coal that heated homes and powered industry remained in mines on Kyushu because ships could not safely carry it to Honshu. The statistics of Operation Starvation reveal its staggering effectiveness. By war's end, B-29s had dropped approximately 12,000 mines in Japanese waters, a number that seems modest until one considers the impact per weapon deployed. Those 12,000 mines sank or damaged 670 ships, totaling over 1.2 million tons of shipping. This figure exceeded the tonnage sunk by the entire American submarine force during the final year of the war. The cost-effectiveness was extraordinary. Each B-29 mining sortie cost roughly $20,000 in fuel, ordnance, and operational expenses, yet the average sortie contributed to sinking vessels worth millions of dollars. No other application of air power in the Pacific Theater achieved comparable returns on investment. The human toll of the mining campaign was measured not in immediate casualties. Mine detonations killed relatively few sailors compared to submarine torpedo attacks or air raids, but in the slow starvation and economic collapse that the campaign accelerated. Japanese civilians in the home islands, already facing rationing and shortages, found that food imports from Korea and Manchuria ceased arriving. Rice stocks dwindled. Factories closed for lack of coal. Trains stopped running. The malnutrition and disease that resulted from these shortages killed thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, though exact figures are impossible to determine because the effects were systemic rather than attributable to individual attacks. The mines did not explode under hospitals or schools, but they contributed to the deaths that occurred there by strangling the logistics that sustained life. The Japanese attempts to counter the mining campaign demonstrated both ingenuity and futility. Minesweeping forces were expanded, given priority for fuel allocations, equipped with improved detection gear. Special wooden-hulled vessels were constructed to reduce magnetic signatures. Degaussing stations were established in major ports to neutralize ships' magnetic fields before they entered mined waters. Acoustic sweeps using noisemakers and decoy vessels attempted to trigger mines before merchant ships transited channels. All of these measures achieved some success, particularly in heavily used channels where constant sweeping could maintain limited safe passage. But the pace of mining exceeded the capacity to sweep. For every mine detonated by countermeasures, another was dropped from a B-29's bomb bay. The Japanese were fighting a war of attrition that they could not win because the Americans could deliver mines faster than they could be cleared. The integration of aerial mining with other forms of naval warfare created synergies that multiplied effectiveness. Submarines, pushed out of coastal waters by shallow depths and intensive anti-submarine patrols, found that mining operations drove ships into deeper waters where torpedo attacks were feasible. Aircraft carriers launching conventional bombing raids against ports found that ships were concentrated in fewer harbors, making attacks more productive. The mining campaign didn't exist in isolation, but as part of a comprehensive effort to destroy Japan's maritime logistics. Each component reinforced the others, creating cumulative pressure that the Japanese economy could not withstand. The technical evolution of the mines during the campaign reflected lessons learned from operational experience and Japanese countermeasures. Early mines were relatively simple, detonating on first contact with acoustic or magnetic signatures. Japanese minesweepers quickly learned to trigger these mines safely using decoys. The Americans responded with counter-counted mines that would ignore several detections before detonating, rendering sweeping operations unreliable. When the Japanese adapted by increasing the number of sweeping passes, the Americans introduced random counters that made prediction impossible. When Japanese ships began degaussing to reduce magnetic signatures, the Americans deployed acoustic-only mines in greater numbers. The cat-and-mouse game continued throughout the campaign, with American adaptability consistently outpacing Japanese countermeasures. The end of the war came before Operation Starvation reached its full potential impact. By August 1945, the mining campaign had reduced Japanese imports to approximately 10% of their pre-campaign levels, but the full consequences of this collapse would have required months to manifest completely. Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the war, not because of starvation, though starvation was approaching. The post-war Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that aerial mining had been the most efficient anti-shipping strategy employed in the Pacific, and estimated that continuation of the campaign at the same intensity would have rendered Japan incapable of sustaining its war effort by late 1945 or early 1946. Whether this would have forced surrender without invasion or atomic weapons is unknowable, but the trajectory was clear. The lessons of Operation Starvation had implications that extended far beyond the immediate context of the Pacific War. The campaign demonstrated that air power could accomplish strategic objectives traditionally associated with naval blockade, doing so with greater speed and efficiency than surface vessels could achieve. It showed that precision targeting of logistical networks could be more effective than mass destruction of industrial capacity. It proved that psychological effects, the fear and uncertainty created by invisible mines, could be as important as physical destruction in degrading enemy capabilities. And it illustrated that technical sophistication could multiply force effectiveness, allowing relatively small numbers of aircraft and weapons to achieve disproportionate strategic impact. The post-war development of aerial mining reflected these lessons, but also the strategic priorities of the Cold War era. Nuclear weapons and intercontinental bombers dominated military planning, relegating conventional mining to secondary importance. The United States Navy maintained mining capability, conducting operations during the Korean War and Vietnam War, but never again at the scale or with the decisive effect achieved against Japan. Soviet doctrine emphasized defensive mining to protect coastal waters and submarine bastions, while NATO strategies focused on mining to restrict Soviet naval access to the Atlantic. The mines themselves became more sophisticated. Bottom-sitting mines gave way to mobile devices that could reposition themselves. Acoustic sensors were supplemented by magnetic, pressure, and seismic detectors, and nuclear warheads were developed for destroying submarines and surface ships with single detonations. The environmental legacy of World War II aerial mining persists in the 21st century. Thousands of mines dropped during Operation Starvation and similar campaigns remain in place, their explosives degraded but still potentially dangerous. Some areas of the Shimonoseki Strait were not fully cleared until decades after the war. Fishermen occasionally snag mines in their nets, requiring disposal by military ordnance teams. The cost of clearing these remnant weapons, measured against the limited hazard they currently pose, has resulted in many areas being designated as exclusion zones rather than being swept. The waters that were battlegrounds in 1945 carry scars that will persist for generations. The men who flew the mining missions received little recognition compared to crews who bombed cities or attacked naval targets. Mining operations lacked the visual drama that makes for compelling photography or memorable stories. A mine falling into dark water provides no explosion, no flames, no visible confirmation of success. The results appeared in statistics compiled weeks later. Ships sunk when no aircraft were nearby. Harbors closed through cumulative effect rather than single strikes. The crews understood they were contributing to victory, but rarely felt the immediate satisfaction that comes from seeing targets destroyed. They were technicians conducting precision operations in obscurity, and history has treated them accordingly. Curtis LeMay, reflecting on the Pacific bombing campaign after the war, acknowledged that aerial mining had been more effective than he initially expected. His commitment to incendiary attacks on cities never wavered. He believed that the firebombing campaign was militarily justified and strategically necessary. But he conceded that mining achieved remarkable results for relatively modest investment. The admission was characteristic of LeMay's pragmatism. He had resisted mining operations when they were proposed, accepted them when ordered, and supported their expansion when results proved their worth. His primary loyalty was to effectiveness, however it was achieved. The Japanese perspective on Operation Starvation emphasized the campaign's contribution to the final collapse of resistance. Post-war testimonies from military and civilian officials described a nation whose capacity to continue fighting was being eroded faster than it could be rebuilt. The mining campaign received specific mention as a factor that could not be countered, a form of warfare that exploited Japan's geographic vulnerability in ways that conventional attacks did not. The psychological impact was also noted, the sense that even internal waters were no longer safe, that the Americans could strike anywhere at any time with weapons that could not be detected or avoided. The combination of physical destruction and psychological pressure created a climate of hopelessness that contributed to the willingness to surrender when the final ultimatums were delivered. The strategic success of aerial mining against Japan raised questions about why the technique was not employed earlier in the war. The B-29 had been operational since mid-1944, and mining operations could theoretically have begun then. The delay was due to multiple factors: doctrinal resistance within the Army Air Forces, production priorities that emphasized other weapon types, the time required to train crews in specialized techniques, and the sequential logic of the island-hopping campaign that only brought the Mariana Islands into American hands in late 1944. By the time all these factors aligned, It was early 1945. The campaign lasted 5 months instead of 15, and Japan surrendered before the full potential could be realized. Whether earlier implementation would have shortened the war significantly is debatable, but the possibility exists. The comparison between aerial mining and submarine warfare is inevitable, but imperfect. Submarines achieved their remarkable toll through years of continuous operations, adapting to Japanese countermeasures, surviving depth charge attacks, operating in all weather and all seasons. The submarine campaign was a marathon of attrition that ground down Japanese merchant shipping through persistence and courage. Aerial mining was a sprint, a concentrated burst of effort that achieved comparable destruction in a fraction of the time. Both were essential. Both worked. The appropriate conclusion is not that one was superior to the other, but that their combination was devastatingly effective, creating a multi-layered threat that Japan could not counter. The technology demonstrated in Operation Starvation, precision navigation, radar-guided delivery, sophisticated fusing systems, coordinated campaign planning, represented the maturation of air power as a strategic tool. The B-29 crews were not simply dropping weapons, they were conducting technical operations that required navigation accuracy measured in hundreds of yards, timing precision measured in seconds, and coordination across hundreds of aircraft and thousands of miles. This was industrial warfare at its most refined, the application of engineering and logistics to the systematic destruction of an enemy's capacity to resist. The moral questions raised by such warfare, the distinction between combatants and civilians, the proportionality of means to ends, the long-term consequences of strategic bombing, were not answered by Operation Starvation, but they were certainly raised. 90 days to deploy, 12,000 mines, 670 ships sunk or damaged, 1.2 million tons of shipping destroyed. These numbers represent the mechanical efficiency of Operation Starvation, the quantifiable results that justified the campaign in military planning documents and post-war assessments. But behind the statistics were individual tragedies multiplied by thousands. Merchant sailors killed in explosions they never saw coming. Coastal communities cut off from supplies they needed to survive. Families separated by blockaded waters. An empire collapsing under the weight of invisible barriers that could not be breached. The mines did not discriminate between military and civilian vessels, between warships and coastal ferries. They detonated when their sensors detected targets, and the targets were ships carrying people whose deaths contributed to victory, but who died nonetheless. The campaign was successful. The statistics prove it. The post-war assessments confirm it. The contribution to Japan's defeat was significant, perhaps decisive, in accelerating surrender. But success in war is measured in objectives achieved and enemies defeated, not in the human costs required to achieve those objectives. Operation Starvation was militarily brilliant and strategically effective. It was also a campaign that strangled an island nation, starved its population, and killed thousands of people who had no direct role in military operations. Both things are true. History records the success. Morality must grapple with the cost. And the ocean, which received 12,000 mines and holds the wreckage of 600 ships, offers no answers. Only the silence of deep water where the weapons remain, waiting for nothing, guarding approaches to harbors that now welcome ships from every nation without discrimination or threat.